So just last week, Attorney General Bill Barr issued a 4-page summary outlining what he says are the highlights of a 300-plus page Mueller report. The full report, even if redacted, is expected to be published by mid-April or perhaps sooner. While the special counsel determined that the president did not collude with Russia, according to the AG, Mueller did not come to any firm conclusions about obstruction of justice allegations.
So, and heading to prison next month, President Trump's former attorney, Michael Cohen. Cohen has become a player in the case against the president. His testimony on Capitol Hill, it was riveting, but his credibility has come into question. So joining us now to talk about whether Cohen's testimony contributed to evidence of criminal activity by the president and his attorney, Lanny Davis. Welcome, Lanny. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Regarding your introduction, I don't know who's called his credibility into question other than he's pled guilty, but the documents speak for themselves. And one thing that was quite interesting to me is that while the Republicans put up a sign, "Liar, liar, pants on fire," which shows the level of focus they have, they never once mentioned Donald Trump signing a check while President of the United States for $35,000 that nobody disputes was a hush money payment for the Stormy Daniels cover-up. And yet that subject was never once raised by the Republicans, and that document speaks for itself. It's not about Michael Cohen's credibility.
Well, why do you think that that document hasn't gotten more attention? Now, we have the images we can put up. You know, you've got 2 checks here, and one of them very clearly signed by the President of the United States while he was, in fact, the President of the United States to Michael Cohen. Now, Cohen alleges this was essentially repayment for
wait. Michael Cohen does not allege that. The federal prosecutors found it in federal court. That there's no allegation or credibility issue here. Federal prosecutors found that Donald Trump directed and coordinated an illegal hush money scheme, and the payment of $35,000 a month, was a payoff for what was a fictitious legal services retainer agreement, which the federal government said, prosecutors said, never existed. So this is not a matter in dispute. It's not a matter about credibility. That check signed by a president is a fact that cannot be denied as a felony committed by the President of the United States, which, thanks to Michael Cohen and his testimony, is now before federal prosecutors. They can't indict a president, but they can indict Don Jr. because the second check was signed by Don Jr., the same $35,000 a month installment payment for the hush money.
So, Lanny, the federal prosecutors have really come to be the gods amongst a lot of Democrats now that Bob Mueller has found that there was no collusion and has not exonerated, but at least not found any evidence of obstruction of justice. So, tell us a little bit more about the specifics that Mr. Cohen is working with the Southern District of New York, especially regarding this Trump Tower Moscow payment. And regarding that payment, what evidence has he given that the President of the United States told him specifically in order to lie to investigators about this deal?
Well, first of all, on the answer to your question, I'm going to challenge your premise of your question again. Sorry.
It's your thing today.
Please.
That's fine. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, but I'll answer your question.
I'll
answer your question first. I can't talk about what Mr. Cohen testified to both intelligence committees concerning the guidance he was given by I'm using the word guidance, he was given by President Trump and counselors before he testified falsely that the Trump Tower discussions ended the day before the Iowa caucuses, which was February 1st, 2016. He used the date January 31st. That was false. He was given guidance by a number of people to use that date, even though he continued to negotiate on that Trump Tower meeting. I will tell you, though, that there's one anecdote that Mr. Cohen has shared that I can relate, and that is about that Mr. Trump would be at a rally, and he'd be saying, after the campaign was ongoing for several months in 2016, no Russian collusion, no Russians, no deals, no contacts. And then maybe a few minutes later or a few days later, he'd ask Mr. Cohen, hey, what's going on with the Moscow deal? Now, does that bother Trump supporters that at rallies they'd be cheering when he'd say no contacts, no Russia, and then he'd say to Mr. Cohen, what's going on with Moscow? But really the most important issue for me is why Mr. Cohen is serving this length of time for what is, compared to others who have not paid income taxes, a minor sum of $275,000 a year, whereas Floyd Mayweather didn't pay $18 million a year and got a civil penalty. So the disproportionality of this sentence, I would respectfully suggest, should be reconsidered, and he should be given credit for the criminal evidence that he put before the American people using documents such as this check as credit
the
for
federal
the
prosecutors that you revere are also the ones who recommended this sentence in this particular case.
And at the time, I'm not challenging their sincerity. I did challenge their judgment over the last several months, where now Mr. Cohen is now cooperating, providing additional information to them. But I do suggest respectfully that Donald Jr., based upon signing a hush money check for his father, out of a trust fund, by the way, that was set up to prevent any money being spent that would help Donald Trump while he was president. Out of that trust fund is where the Donald Jr. check was written. That is a crime, and he should be, in my opinion, respectfully indicted based upon just the signing of that check.
So is your client, is Michael Cohen fully cooperating at this point? Because there was some question earlier of if there were sort of limits to that cooperation.
Well, I can't respond because this is a very delicate issue.
Sure.
He is meeting with, sharing with the Southern District prosecutors additional important information of criminal conduct. The disproportionality of that sentence, we're respectfully asking be reviewed, and that we hope that the full cooperation he's giving to both the House Intelligence Committee, the public testimony in the House Oversight Committee, and now the House Judiciary Committee be taken into account when that sentence is reviewed in its disproportionality.
I'd also like to get your reaction to the Mueller investigation, the finding of no collusion, particularly given that that Michael Cohen was so heavily implicated in the Steele dossier. So have they found that? Do you accept those conclusions, or does Michael Cohen accept the finding of no collusion and the finding of no obstruction of justice?
Well, that's where I was going to take issue with. Let me repeat clearly in plain English. Nothing has yet come forward with a finding of no obstruction of justice. Nothing. This is Mr. Barr interpreting the absence of a finding to be a finding. What he reported was that Mr. Mueller said nothing either way about obstruction. Nothing either way about obstruction. And Mr. Mueller was quoted by Mr. Barr as saying, this does not constitute an exoneration on the issue of obstruction. So with all due respect to you, I think you overstated even what Mr. Barr told us Mr. Mueller said on obstruction. In my opinion, the evidence on its face shows obstruction of justice. When he lied about so many things on Air Force One, he lied about the Trump Tower meeting and said it was about adoption. And then Mr. Don Jr. had to admit that it was about dirt on Hillary.
Well, that wasn't to a federal court. That was to the press. He did lie to the press, absolutely.
But the pattern of lying about something asks the question, why lie unless you're worried about something? Why not admit the Trump Tower meeting? For example, Mr. Cohen testified that during a meeting with Mr. Trump several days before the Trump Tower meeting, which he reconstructed a year later when he put it all together, Don Jr. came into the room, and you may recall from his testimony, while Mr. Cohen was sitting there, walked behind his father's desk, which Mr. Cohen noted was unusual in and of itself, leaned over and said, the meeting is on. And Don Sr., now President Trump, didn't say what meeting. He said, good, let me know. Now, why didn't he say what meeting? If he knew ahead of time about that meeting, the meeting itself was on its face collusion. You had the Russian government official there. You had an email that said dirt on Hillary, and you had a sentence in the email saying Russia wants to help Trump get elected. Now, if that isn't on its face, as Adam Schiff has said, a meeting about colluding between Paul Manafort was there, chairman of the campaign, Mr. Kushner was there, son-in-law, Don Jr. was there, and Russian officials were there. And what were they talking about? The Russian government helping Trump get elected by meddling. So that's a colluding conspiracy meeting. And the question that Michael Cohen asked without an answer is, when Don Jr. leaned over in front of people and said to his dad earlier than that meeting, and he reconstructed this a year later when he read about the meeting, The meeting is on. Why didn't Donald Trump say what meeting?
Well, only Michael Cohen is the one who is alleging this, and the special counsel did issue a definitive finding, at least from what Attorney General Bill Barr has told us, on no collusion. Now, I do want to also get to Ivanka Trump. This is one of the most serious allegations.
By the way, your comment that only Michael Cohen, nobody is denied that Don Jr. leaned over and said what meeting. I'm drawing an inference. There's no direct evidence that Donald Trump picked up the phone.
We don't know that that's what the meeting was that they were talking about.
We don't know. And I asked a question.
Right.
Why didn't Donald Trump say what meeting? So there's an inference. Just as there's an inference when Roger Stone calls Donald Trump a few days before the emails are released in October and says, I spoke to Assange, he's going to release the emails. Did Donald Trump say, wait a minute, that would be a crime, I'm calling the FBI?
Well, again, we have not yet heard anything from the Mueller investigation about whether that phone call actually took place. Both parties, I think Roger Stone has said that never happened, and the president has denied it. So there's no actual evidence yet to support that claim.
Well, well, that's true. I'm reporting on what Michael Cohen says, and there's no documentation, as there is with this check. There's no denying this check.
Right.
So we do have to wait to see whether Mr. Mueller has other evidence of who else was in the room. The lady who controls all access to Mr. Trump called in and said, Roger Stone is calling. That would be evidence that Mr. Cohen is telling the truth. So we'll have to wait to read the report when and if Mr. Barr releases the report.
I look forward to it.
I want to ask you a little bit more about the campaign finance piece. Now, you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you believe Don Jr. should be indicted.
Yes.
Based on the evidence of this check and potentially other evidence that Mr. Cohen has provided.
It's evidence of guilt in involvement in a campaign finance violation.
There's been some conversation about modifying the statute of limitations so that President Trump could not be saved from prosecution by getting reelected. Is that something that you and your client support?
I don't want to get into that. It's beyond my brief in representing Mr. Cohen. I do believe that the Southern District of New York prosecutors have been open to hearing more evidence. And if there is evidence that suggests that Donald Trump should be indicted after he leaves office, then that would be their judgment in the Southern District. But let me remind you what they already have said publicly to answer your question. They found that Donald Trump directed and coordinated a crime. So the statute of limitations tolls as of the moment that they make that finding. And when he, in fact, right before the election, authorized this hush money scheme to pay $130,000 to an adult film star. There is no dispute that the government found that. So I don't think there's a statute of limitations problem, but we'll see.
We interviewed Mayor Giuliani, one of the president's lawyers, last week, and he argues that Michael Cohen pled guilty to something that's not a crime, that based on the John Edwards case and other legal findings, that if you make a payment that is at least partially for personal reasons, that doesn't have to be reported, that doesn't constitute a crime. Is that your reading of the law?
Actually, Giuliani is probably the best person to support my position. I hate to say that and surprise your audience. It was Mr. Giuliani that called these checks $35,000 a month reimbursements. The invention, the lie, the cover-up that Mr. Trump directed, according to prosecutors, not according to Mr. Cohen, was that it was a retainer of $35,000 a month. That was a lie, according to prosecutors. There was no retainer agreement. Mr. Giuliani said it was a reimbursement to Mr. Cohen. Now, as to whether or not it's a campaign finance violation, if part of your motive is you don't want your wife to know, and part of your motive is 3 days before the election, after Access Hollywood, you don't want the American people, especially in Trump country, evangelical Christians, to know that you had an affair with a porn star. If there are mixed motives, it's up to a jury to decide. In the John Edwards case, during the primary election, before the nomination, they decided the primary motive was personal. 3 days before the election, a jury could well decide that the motive was political protection, which is what Mr. Trump and everyone talked about, paying off Stormy Daniels right now. Now, that's up to a jury. Mr. Justice Giuliani has already decided the jury verdict. An indictment is a presentation of evidence. Now it's up to the individual to be allowed under due process, including Mr. Trump, to defend themselves with the presumption of innocence. But let's let a jury decide, not Mr. Giuliani.
Now, you are Michael Cohen's lawyer, but you also know your way around the political arena, I think it's fair to say. Why do you think, just as you, Lanny Davis, putting your Politico hat on, why do you think this hasn't been a bigger deal? Why do you think that the American people aren't fixating on the fact that the president stands credibly accused of committing a crime while holding the office of the presidency?
First of all, I'm a frustrated journalist. I love media. I love people who work for a living as journalists. So what I'm about to say, I don't want to seem anti-media. I think the media has grown numb and hasn't reported this story. If the American people understood that there's no dispute of fact, with all due respect to you, there's no allegation about this check. It speaks for itself. It's not about Michael Cohen. It's about a president signing a check for $35,000, which the prosecutors already have found is an illegal hush money payment. American people don't know that because the media has moved on. Now, in their defense, they do their job every day, and there's all of you here at the Hill. There's so much coming in. How do you keep up with everything that Donald Trump is doing and saying every day? But this is such a major story with a graphic of a signature on a check that I am mystified why the major mass media, mainstream media, hasn't gone with this check story and repeated it over and over again until the American people know about it. Very few people in America go on a street corner and ask them whether they know about a $35,000 check written by a president for hush money. They'll say, what? So that's one of the reasons that I really wanted to be on today, is to talk about this check and the disproportionality of the sentence that, with all due respect to the Southern District, I hope they'll review once again now that they see Michael Cohen cooperating and providing great time and effort with the congressional committees to get to the truth.
Well, Lanny Davis, we appreciate you as always coming by. Thank you.
Forgive me challenging. You've been so nice to me.
I enjoy it.
Not a problem. Great to see you, sir. Coming up on Rising, the Me Too conversation impacts Joe Biden. Also, Twitter is considering changing how they label politicians' tweets, including the president's.
And to quote Buck, he's a SoulCycle instructor mixed with an Aaron Sorkin character. What Beto O'Rourke had to say at his official campaign launch. Team Rising weighs in next.